Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Trey Hester, Digital Director for War on the Rocks. In our latest episode of Horns, we get to hear from Colonel Liam Collins, who dissects how Russia used hybrid warfare in Georgia, what it learned from that experience, and how it applied to those lessons in Ukraine, allowing it to take Crimea without firing a single shot. He also discusses Russia's goals in Eastern Europe and how those countries can deter the Big Bear. Colonel Collins is a career Special Forces officer and director of the Modern War Institute at West Point. This event took place at the University of Texas at Austin and was sponsored by the Strauss Center and the Clemens Center. Enjoy the show.
All right, so between 2016 and 2018, I went over to Ukraine with General Abzaid every 4 to 6 weeks. So that was kind of like my moonlighting job where I was trying to do my day job back at West Point. And so he pulled me in 2016. So I guess this is kind of how these things come together. So Secretary appointed him as senior defense advisor to Ukraine for defense reform. So advising their president, their minister of defense, and chief of defense for defense reform. And then on our side, kind of helping shape and execute U.S. policy. So he tells the Pentagon Officer Secretary of Defense for Policy, hey, I want, retired four-star general, and they don't give him a staff, and they say, hey, I want you to, he tells them, I want Liam to go with me, and they're like, well, we don't have money for that. He's like, you're not listening to me. I want Liam to go. And he's like, well, we don't have money. He's like, well, I'm not going unless Liam goes. They're like, oh, we got money for that. So it's amazing to be. So anyway, our first trip over there is in October of 2016. So what's going on in October of 2016? In the U.S. There's an election going on, right? You might remember. So, of course, their president's interested in this. So they're flying to the east, right, to the combat zone for the first time out there. So General Abzaid's sitting next to President Poroshenko, their minister and chief of defense. And President Poroshenko asks him, who's going to win the election? And he says, I'm pretty sure Clinton's going to win. He's like, are you sure? So he's like, I've lived long enough to know you can never be sure about anything, but I'm pretty sure Clinton's going to win. He said, what happens if Trump wins? So General Abzaid looks out the window, points east, says, we're going to advise them. So in November, we're over there on election day, and we're like, holy cow, Trump might win this thing. So we're back again in December, doing the ribbon cutting ceremony for their new special operations training facility, and we see President Poroshenko, and he comes up, your joke is not so funny anymore. I said, well, I wouldn't have made it if I would have thought he was going to win. So, right, it's the old lesson we all know. You always got to be careful about the jokes you make. So I'll be talking about hybrid war, Ukraine and U.S. policy. So I'll go a little bit on kind of, so you can understand the impact of the war, a little bit on hybrid war, and then kind of we'll talk about Russia in particular, and then kind of the way ahead a little bit. So, right, this is what people think of when they think of Syria, right? A lot of destruction going on. But when you think of Ukraine, it's not really in the news, right? Maybe it was in the news back in 2016, but it's not really front and center anymore, given our news cycle, right, moving on to something else. But this is what it looks like. And if you got the kind of down here in the lower, corner of the map, right, the shaded, right, this is Ukraine, those shaded areas, right, the one in Crimea in the south and two down in the southeast, the Donbass areas, it's called, right, the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, right, part of them that's under the control of the Russian-led separatists. So that area there is about 2/3 the size of Ireland and a roughly the same size population, or at least pre-war, roughly the same size population. So when you're thinking about what that is to the east of Donbass, right, that's Ireland when you're thinking about what it is. If you think about the impact of the conflict, I mean, how many lives did we lose, soldiers did we lose in Iraq? Right, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, right? That's roughly what Ukraine has lost. A smaller country has lost, right, in a much shorter period of time in the west there, in the east, right? And they've lost a number of number of civilians killed, right? The destruction. But you think of, okay, what's the economic impact of the conflict right there, right? Their GDP, effectively cut in half. Yet, sure, you lost Crimea to the south, and think of right the land that you lost in Donbass. But right, still, that's a significant hit. How much? Right, during the Great Recession, how much did our GDP recede by? Right, the Great Recession, what did it go down by? Anybody guess? A student? We got a guess for 8%, about 3%, right? And that's a Great Recession. So getting cut by 50%, pretty significant. It's ticked back up somewhat in the last few years. And then, right, think about the social impact, right? The closing of these borders. I mean, for the Ukrainians, this is the equivalent of us going and invading Canada. That is really what it's like. Completely unimaginable to Ukrainians that this would happen, right? And that's what it is from their perspective. And really, internally displaced, personnel, persons about 1.5 million, right? So pretty significant impact in terms of the conflict. Okay, I mean, you kind of go back, understand a little bit of history, right? With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right? When the republics all kind of broke apart, become independent nations, they had to keep the borders that they had at that time, right? They weren't able to redraw them, so that right, just like we see problems with in the Middle East and elsewhere with these borders that are drawn, the same challenge here, right? So talk about Georgia in a little bit, but the main thing to consider here is, right, Crimea wasn't always part of Ukraine. It was given to them by the Russians, I believe, in the 50s. And so when they gave it to them, it wasn't something they ever thought about having to, get back later or something. And so maybe if they could have redrawn the lines in 1991, you wouldn't have had this problem with Crimea in 2014. Okay, this you should, if you want to, right, if I tell you that Ukraine has 45 million people, that means absolutely nothing to you, right? But think of it compared to California, roughly the population the size of California in terms of size, right? You understand this, roughly the size of Texas when you think about how big it is. Dialect, roughly 2/3 Ukraine is the primary language, roughly 1/3 Russian is the primary language. And you see right kind of on the map here, the darker, higher percentage where Russia is the primary language. And then the lighter it is, Ukraine is the primary language. And don't confuse you think just because someone speaks Russian means they want to be Russian and want that to be part of Russia, right? They, just like in the Baltics, the ethnic Russians that live there, they kind of like having civil liberties and they like having generally a higher standard of living than the neighbors across the border, even if they, even if some of them feel that they're a Russian more than they are Ukrainian. And then when we were in the, in the East, we've been there and they rotate troops through the East just like we would rotate troops in Afghanistan or Iraq. And they have forces from the East that speak Russian, and they're rotating in there, fighting the Russian-led separatists just like any other force. So don't confuse the fact that, right, just because they speak Russian, that they want to be Russian. Right, so Putin will say, right, or others, Mearsheimer will say, hey, this is Putin's just a normal response to the expansion of NATO, right? It's a realism response. I think a lot of others with experience in the region would disagree. But you can see, right, how NATO has kind of expanded over time. But to keep in mind, right, I mean, Ukraine and kind of Georgia have special status, right, to Russia, right? Their interest in Ukraine and Georgia will always be greater than ours. That doesn't mean we give them a blank check to do what they want there, but their interest will always be greater there. Okay, so we kind of go look at hybrid war. So hybrid war, think of it as a mix of conventional and irregular war in a highly fluid and efficient format using modern information measures. Again, a combination of regular, irregular, flexible, fluid, using modern information measures. Is this new? So we got some heads shaking, no. Right, this is nothing new. This goes back to, the beginning of warfare. Think of our own Revolutionary War, right? We had regulars, we had irregulars, right? We had propaganda, right? This is nothing new. The difference is, right, lethality has increased, right? Modern information, right? Information flow is so much quicker, right? And so this is what changed, but the idea of it has not. And this goes back to Clausewitz, right? He talked about direct, which is where he spent most of his writing on, the direct conflict, right? Aimed at capturing territories, defeating enemies in the battlefield, and then the indirect, right? Attriting them and tiring them out. And so hybrid's kind of in the middle, right? It can move more towards that conventional, or it can be move more towards that exhaustion strategy. And so Russia had experience, right, fighting the Chechens in the 90s and kind of learning from that experience there as the Chechens kind of would do that. They would kind of do guerrilla attacks, but then at the same time, they could come together and conduct large-scale ambush operations against the Russian forces. And so they learned from that. And then so kind of moving forward in 2007, they moved this Soviet memorial from downtown town to a kind of cemetery in the outskirts of town, along with some Red Army graves. So this pissed the Russians off. So what they conducted was a relatively unsophisticated denial of service attack, but nonetheless, it crippled the Estonian government, their banking system, right, freezing everybody out of getting the money from ATMs, and really kind of crippled them for 2 to 3 days. Of course, the Russians deny it, but it was the Russians that did it. But we kind of see this is the first case of really seeing offensive cyber against another nation for political purposes. And then the next summer, right, 2008 is when we see the Russians go into Georgia, and so they really learned from this conflict. So this is not a great map necessarily, right? But Georgia is in here, right? These shaded areas, right? Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These have always been kind of semi-autonomous regions within Georgia. Russian peacekeepers were in South Ossetia, and they fought a civil war within Georgia back in 1991 when they gained independence. So South Ossetia, every summer they typically get a little squirrely, send some artillery shells across that border, the administrative border, into Georgia. Georgia might return fire, kind of low-level conflict. But in 2008, Russia did their large-scale exercise that they do every year. But instead of all the Russian forces going home, right, they left divisions right on the Georgian border to the north. And so what Russia was trying to do is basically provoke Georgia into going into South Ossetia, which they did. But the international community, for the most part, saw this as a preemptive attack by Georgia. Right, the Russians were going to come across. It was there. Right. Also, here's the first time we kind of see cyber being used at the same time as with kinetic operations and conventional forces. And those cyber attacks actually started 2 weeks in advance of the ground forces moving across the border. Right. So it was pretty obvious that the Russians, this was a planned operation. And again, it was kind of instigated because of Georgia's desire to join NATO and the EU. And so this was kind of Russia pushing back on that. Ultimately, the war only lasted 5 days, right? There was no way that the Georgians could overcome the Russian forces when they came across the border, pushed out here, not too far from Tbilisi. And they only have 4 brigades. The Georgians only had 4 brigades, and their best brigade was in Iraq at the time, supporting the coalition effort down there. But nonetheless, the Georgians fought, when they actually did fight them, in kind of equal numbers, fought fairly well against the Russians. So the Russians learned from this and they studied it. They said, hey, conscript army kind of sucks, right? We got to have some, they don't fight very well. And so if we're going to go somewhere, don't do conscripts. In terms of international, or in terms of IO, right, information operations, they really lost the IO battle, right? They were hoping to provoke Georgia into conducting its attack, but for the most part, the world saw it as a preemptive attack, and so they're like, hey, we've got to have better messaging on this, and they kind of learned also, like, hey, when you send large formations across the border, it's really hard to win that battle of opinion and the public opinion on that. So they looked at that. Also, right, what we see all here is kind of electronic warfare, trying to cut off Tbilisi, right, the capital, the government, from the units in the field, right, so they can't have their command and control. Get those orders from their political or military leadership in the capital, right? So we see a combination of kind of cyber with electronic warfare, aimed at those C2 mechanisms for that. And then Russian reforms follow from this. So what's going on? What are we doing at the time in 2008? Where are we at?
Presidential election.
Okay, but we're coming right off of the surge in Iraq, right? Surge started in early 2007. We're kind of tapering off the end of the surge, right? So we, for the most part, were not paying attention to what was going on over here. And the Russians were studying this intensively. And so between this and the next 6 years, they perfected the ability to do this, at least in a neighboring country, right? In terms of IO, right? I mean, who has not been to an international hotel anywhere in the world and not found RT on the TV, right? I mean, establishing these, right, media outlets, media messaging all over the world, right? And so that's what they learned from there. So in 2004, right, this was clearly something, a war plan that they had on the shelf, and they were just waiting for the time to execute it, right? And the opportunity presented itself in February of 2014, right? So following the Maidan Revolution, right, President Yanukovych flees, right? They install interim president. Ukraine makes some not so great decisions, right? Some language laws and other things angering the ethnic Russians. And then in Crimea, right, this is where we see the little green men going in. They learned from Georgia, right? Sending large formations across the border is not a good thing. Let's put little green men in. It didn't hurt, right? They had a status of forces agreement. So even though they were increasing the number of forces flowing into Sevastopol, their port there, it'd be the same as us, right? If we have an agreement with Germany that says we can have 150,000 soldiers and we only have 100,000, and we're inserting 50,000, right? Not all over the country in little green men, but into the base there, right? It's not necessarily, it's not a violation of the status of forces agreement at the time. Clearly, the little green men were. Ultimately, right, seizing the government facilities in Crimea through various measures. And then ousting the government, right, establishing a new local government. We'll kind of go into it a little bit more detail, but right, establishing a new government. What does that government do? It's going to ask the international community for help. That's what we do, right? Responsibility to protect, right? Using Western norms against the West. And then who's going to come to their defense? The Russians will come, right? And ultimately, right, they vote for independence and then annexation with Russia. Ultimately, Russia's able to seize Crimea without firing a single shot, right? Stroke of genius. And unfortunately, right, I think they took the Ukrainians listened to the advice coming from the West that was, hey, don't resist. We'll solve this diplomatically, which I think was a big mistake, or at least that's what the evidence points to. But what we saw here is a lot of information operations, right? Establishing, really just disinformation, just enough to make it questionable, right? I guarantee every Western leader knew what little green men were. They knew who they were, right? But it gave them enough plausible deniability. Really, I don't think it's plausible. I don't think there's such a thing as plausible deniability. I think it's just deniability. It's not plausible, right? But enough deniability because Germany, France, others, right? They don't want to get involved in Ukraine. They just want to return to trade with Russia and just kind of turn away the other way. So ultimately, right, any excuse they have to not act, right, they're going to seize that, right? So, right, they can claim we don't know who these people are, right? So using the information operations, electronic warfare, right, really cutting off the forces down there in Crimea from Kyiv, right? So they establish a media monopoly and they're going after, right, targets that they were seizing, right? Any kind of radio towers, TV towers, those kind of things, so they control, right? An information monopoly there within the region. Again, so that, right, the people at the bases, they don't know what to do, right? And then the Russians might either through, right, their sources, criminal gangs, right, non-government organizations that they're supporting in the area, right? If the soldiers are going to the base and then you got a bunch of protesters outside the base, what do you do? Are you going to fight through these protesters to get to your weapons? What do you do, right? So these kind of things that they're doing, right? Cyber operations, the same kind of thing, right? Crippling, cutting those, right, command and control networks, right? And then the regular warfare kind of with those little green men. But again, within 30 days, I mean, sheer brilliance that they were able to take this without a shot being fired. Then, okay, so then kind of what follows in there. So then kind of out in the west, right, again, these are the two, right, the Luhansk Oblast and Donetsk Oblast, kind of like half of those, this is kind of where it is. So, yeah, no doubt there are separatists out there that would like to be part of Russia. They're clearly the minority. But those those separatists are emboldened by what happened in Crimea. Russia provides them support. The Ukrainian army really had done nothing since into the Cold War, right? They had atrophied to really being a shell of what they were and really incapable of doing much. And so volunteers and the army, went out to the West and really ended up pushing these separatists and supported by Russian equipment and Russian advisors. Pretty much everybody from the kind of company command level on up, all those commanders are Russian, leading, right, separatist forces. Pushed them to the border in August of 15, and then the Russians at that point went across the border in mass with Russian tank formations and other forces, of course, which the Russians deny, or they say, hey, we can't control what our soldiers do when they're on vacation, or the term we use is leave. And the way I equate it is like, I've got it, but when I used to go on what we call block leave, where the whole unit takes leave together, when I go on block leave, I would never go on leave with my entire platoon or company. And what we did, we sure didn't take our tanks with us and go across the border into Canada with us with the tanks, right? And so it's just not believable that, right, that the Russians are just taking tanks across the border on their own, right? Or they just really have poor accountability of their equipment. And so the Russians, right, the Ukrainians weren't going to be able to stand toe-to-toe against the Russian equipment, right, T-90 tanks, advanced systems that they had. Ultimately, what it does is they kind of hit where the shaded area is right here, tentative ceasefire with the Minsk I agreement in September of 14. It didn't really hold, and then really what we've been under since then is Minsk II agreement, which is February of 15, which established kind of what you got there now is kind of a trench line. And it really looks kind of like World War I with modern technology. That's the best way to describe it. It's somewhat artificial because if it wasn't a ceasefire, maneuver warfare would kind of open up and the trenches would disappear. But nonetheless, that's what it looks like now. And what you have is, again, is tenuous ceasefire. No one's trying to really gain terrain. but you still have constant probing by the Russian-led separatists, artillery, originating from the Russian-led separatist side, snipers, those kind of things that we see in that area. So any given week, you've still got probably anywhere from 0 to 2 Ukrainians dying and 7 to 10 getting injured still to this day, pretty much on a weekly basis. But this is really kind of where we've been under since then. And again, Minsk II is really, the Ukrainians look at this as this agreement was made under duress, right? This is our sovereign territory. We just made this agreement under duress. And so the kind of the peace what Ambassador Volker is trying to do right now is to figure out what do you do with this piece here? And really, there's no starting point because the Russians want the border to be here, and the Ukrainians want it to be there. And so they really haven't made any progress in what to do there over the last 2 years. But for the Ukrainians, really what it is they look at it as the Budapest Agreement back in 1991 is kind of the agreement that it should be, and they should have their sovereign territory back. So one author kind of lays out this in terms of how the Russians execute hybrid war, right? A preparatory phase, right? This is where they're looking for who can they exploit within the government, economic system, political leadership, who can be exploited, blackmailed, bribed, whatever it takes, that they can take advantage of later, right? Establishing media positions within that country and in the international community, looking for criminal organizations that they can use, find local oligarchs that can be, right, dependent on the Russians, and then ultimately, do it their bidding. And then figuring out how they can, and then information measures to anger local populace, exploit, political, ethnic, religious tensions that might exist, right? Just, leveraging those. So where is Russia doing this political preparation? I hear a U.S. Okay, my question is, where are they not doing it, right? Right. Heavily in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe and the West in general, and I'm sure other places as well, right? And so really, and then they're moving on, right? The attack phase is what we saw, at least in Ukraine, right? They haven't gone to this and elsewhere, right? But attack phase, right? Exploiting these tensions, right? Inserting these little green men. Okay, if these little green men were inserted in Germany, what would happen? Right now, if they got inserted into Germany, what would happen? No, well, maybe, but they probably just get arrested. Well, they're not getting arrested in Ukraine. Why? Because Russia has divisions lined up across their north and the east, right? And if they arrest them, they don't know what Russia will do with these massive formations to their north and east, right? And so it's somewhat dependent on this, but exploiting those tensions, leveraging criminal organizations or other, right? So it's not just Crimea, kind of like stuff, brush fires are all over the country, so they really aren't sure what's going on. Again, cutting, right, electronic warfare, cyber to cut the command and control, so they really aren't sure what's going on. They can't give good guidance and direction. Leveraging these, right, the populace that's dissatisfied with the government, which is not hard to do. Okay, if you think, right, if you look at Ukraine, typically their president's approval ratings over the last, couple decades, they might start out high right after the election, but for them it's really, they often view it as a choice between one corrupt oligarch or another. And so, Poroshenko, recently was sitting in the presidential approval ratings in the teens, which is right on par with our Congress. It's not that hard to a population that's disenfranchised with the government or dissatisfied with their government. It's easier to do there versus somewhere like the Baltics, where all three presidents typically hover around a 70% approval rating. So it's a lot harder to do there. And then moving into the stabilization phase, right? Locking in the gains they have there. Just like in Georgia, when we were in Georgia a few years, I brought a group of cadets over there to study on the borders with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These used to be open borders. The Russians now have them completely closed on South Ossetia. Abkhazia is closed to just one single crossing point. If you go back to we'll go back to the map here. Right, so this shaded area that was red, that was ethnic kind of Georgians within there. Ethnic Georgians within South Ossetia, within Abkhazia. And so what they do to lock in their gains, right, now building actual fences up, a single crossing point, and then making Russian the only language that you can speak in South Ossetia or Abkhazia. Kind of the same thing in Crimea. And the idea, right, they're in it for the long game, right? There's no economic system, they have no economy in these countries. Russia's effectively propping up, 60% or plus of their GDP comes from Russia. But for Russia, it's a small price to pay to ensure that Georgia will never join NATO or EU, because it's hard to join NATO when you have contested borders, right? Who's going to let you in the club if if we're going to have to come to an Article 5 and we don't even know where, right? You can't even control your own territory, right? So Russia's doing that, and again, kind of turning in the long game, right? So if they're, after 20 years or whatever, speaking Russian, right, that's all they know. And kind of the same thing then in Crimea, and ultimately kind of what they're trying to do in the Donbass, right? Just make it last long enough, and again, so that, right, Ukraine can never join NATO or EU because they have these, contested borders within it. In terms of, right, Russian capabilities, so kind of more on the conventional side, what we see in the conflict, right, is as they were using, really this is more in the east, not so much in Crimea, because they were able to take Crimea, again, like I said, without firing a shot in large formations coming across the border. But don't forget, right, it was large formations on the border that helped them able to accomplish that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. Unmanned aerial vehicles, right, we see them using these pretty frequently over there. Ukrainians have some success recently with taking those down. But the idea, right, is if you can be seen, you can be targeted, right? Tying those in with artillery. So as soon as a unmanned aerial vehicle sees you, right, within 10 minutes, then artillery is going to fall on you. Unlike the U.S., it's invested in precision-guided munitions. The Russians invested in long-range, multiple-launch rocket systems, right? So they don't have to identify exactly where you are. They just have to take out what we call an entire grid square, right? Think of, several football fields, right? As long as we know we're close, they just launch it in there, and they're not so worried about collateral damage, right? And again, they'll use our Western norms to our against us, right? So where are they going to, if they have artillery tubes, where are they going to set them up? Right in urban areas, right next to schools, hospitals, churches, right? Try to use our Western norms against us because we might be hesitant to launch a counterstrike against them. Talked a little bit about artillery, but in the Donbass during the heavy fighting, it was caused about 80% of the casualties. Again, kind of going back to World War II, World War I kind of numbers. But because of the artillery is such a casualty-producing weapon, it makes counter-battery radar. These systems like down in the lower left corner there that can tell where artillery strike is originating from. What's the problem with these systems? Anybody know? What's the problem with these radars? All right, huge electromagnetic signature. And so you can't just turn these systems on, right, because then they'll be targeted. So the trick is, how do you turn the systems on just at the right time? And then you got to get them underground because, right, as soon as they illuminate themselves from far away, right, from the electronics signature that it gives off on the electromagnetic spectrum, you can identify them. Same thing, right, that they've seen, through cell phones or other things where the Russians not so much talk about it here a little bit, but kind of a combination of cyber electronic warfare, information operations all together, where we, kind of pinpoint propaganda. The soldiers, they have their cell phones out there. I don't know why they do, because it's just kind of giving them away. But they might have an artillery strike, and then shortly after the artillery strike, everybody gets a text message saying, hey, your corrupt oligarch isn't worth dying for. Go home and save your family. Right? Or your commanders have fled. You need to get out of the area. Right? So we see this pinpoint propaganda information operations on them, tied with all these things. Otherwise, right, we've seen the Ukrainians, right, were having problems kind of getting their artillery to target Russian-led separatist forces, right? So they used, I think it was not Apple, but whatever the other one is. What does Microsoft or Google use? The other server, right? But right, using this system, but then the Russians penetrate that, and they can find out where they're shooting their artillery from, and then you kind of reverse engineering it through cyber means to then target them through their technology. So right, those are kind of the capabilities that we see, and these are things we're going to have to most face out there. And then we see, right, anti-tank weapon systems, right, being very critical. Right, the Russians didn't really have anything to take out the Ukrainian tanks with their reactive armor. So one of the things we tried to do shortly after getting over there was figure out how to try to get Ukrainians some Javelin missiles. Right, so Javelin is like an anti-tank weapons system or anti-vehicular weapon system, and instead of kind of at the side, it's a top attack weapon that's fire and forget. So it comes up and hits the vehicle from the top where its armor is the thinnest. So we thought this is pretty simple. All you have to do is tell the new administration. The old administration didn't want to do this, so therefore you should do it. Right? Just if the old administration did X, just do not X. But even that wasn't so simple. So it took about a year, and then ultimately Javelins. Some Javelin weapon systems went over there in December and January of December 16, January of 17. And again, just enough, right? Not enough to make be a huge difference, but enough so that if the Russians are going to come across the border with their best tanks, they know these things are vulnerable. But yeah, so we can talk a little bit about how that policy piece works a little bit in Q&A if you want. So if you think, okay, so is Russia like a 10-foot monster, right? Are they, executed fait accompli in Crimea, brilliance, but is this exportable, right? Okay, where else can you do this? Okay, you think about what does it rely on? Okay, it relies on kind of probably somebody within their, right, at a border right next to them, right? So they have logistical means right there. It's got to be somewhere that has a large Russian population that gives it the excuse to go there. So you think that's a couple Baltic nations, Latvia and Estonia, not so much Lithuania, right? So you've got to be able to have those things. And so thinking about how do you deter this Russian aggression, not so much maybe in Ukraine going forward, they're still in the middle of a fight, so they have to figure out how to resolve their conflict, but maybe for the Baltics, right? Okay, do they know if NATO will come to their defense? They hope NATO will, but again, coming to the defense and coming to liberate are two different things, right? And so if Russia could beat any of those capitals within a week, how fast could NATO react? By some, one RAND study says it wouldn't be close, right? So then you're looking at, okay, this is a liberation versus defense. But right, it's about deterrent, right? Communicating to the Russians that this will cost, right? It's a cost-benefit calculus. Russia's actually, and Putin is actually fairly rational in what they do. So communicating to Putin, this is it'll be too costly for you to do this. We're going to communicate that on the front end so you'll never come in the first place, right? So one is making the cost of the invasion, increasing the cost of that. And then two, once they occupy, right, communicating to them, it will be expensive, right? So the main thing, right, the message, kind of the porcupine strategy of this is, and communicating to them, this is not going to be the Baltics during the Cold War. This is going to be Afghanistan in the 80s. This is going to be Vietnam for us or Iraq for us, right? And communicating that to the Russians that. So, okay, look at what they can do. Okay, so all the Baltic nations in Georgia, too, have basically given up their Air Force, right? If the Air Force didn't fly against their war with Georgia's war with Russia, and Ukraine, the same thing. They had to ground their Air Force against a no-kidding threat. Why the heck are you investing in these expensive weapon systems? They're a waste of money. Same thing with their navies, right? They're like, a Navy just is expensive, vulnerable platforms that are easily identifiable and easy to take out, and then we just wasted all that money on those things. So they have small coast guards, and so kind of divesting from those, right, expensive platforms, and think of air defense systems, right? Not expensive Patriot missile systems that, again, are easy to identify and take out at the start of the war, and investing in smaller, right, air defense, right, kind of man pads we call them, right, like a Stinger missile. Can't identify where they are, right? You could have it in your car, right, and just pull it out. Same thing with anti-tank weapon systems like the Javelin, right? Again, not a tank that costs $6 million that you think even if you have a good exchange ratio with the enemy and you could take out 3 of their tanks to every one of yours, well, Russia will still just get you with mass, right? So you want to try to beat them, right? You can't outspend them, right? Think of what the GDP of these tiny nations is when Russia spends almost as much on defense as, right, what their total GDP is, right? You can't outspend them, so you want to just increase the cost on the front end as much as possible. And in terms of air defense, what we saw in Georgia took out one of a strategic bomber, a Russian strategic bomber, and really surprised Russia with that, and took out a number of other aircraft, and that really changed how Russia fought. Right, so if you can do this, kind of take out Russia's air force, right, then it makes it more of a ground battle, slows down the speed of the battle, and then you can have more success with these anti-tank weapon systems. And then kind of the third pillar is kind of increasing defense, right? Increase the capability of what you already have, and that's what we were doing in Ukraine, right? How do we make them a more capable military force, right? Professionalization of the non-commissioned officer corps, combined arms, right? Intelligence, whatever it is, logistics, medical services, right? How do we make them better at what they're doing with a relatively fixed budget? How do you be more efficient with what you have? And then, like I said, kind of the reserves, porcupine strategy. So each nation does a little different way of doing this. Lithuania has published 3 manuals of what to do in the case of a Russian invasion, and it's in their constitution, right? That if they get invaded, you're obligated to resist. To really, and then with the manuals, okay, who's the audience for this manual? They publish these online, print them, thousands of copies. Who's this manual for? Who's the intended audience? Right, it's the Russians, right? It's communicating to the Russians. We are serious about this. This isn't cheap talk, right? If you come across the border, again, this is not Cold War where we didn't resist, right? They're embarrassed by their history and kind of teaching this history in the class, right? Civics, re-emphasis on civil education and patriotism in the classroom. And then the other piece of it, right, is just decreasing Russian effectiveness, right? So one, increasing your capability, and then two, making your system less making yourself less vulnerable to these capabilities, right? Cyber, electronic warfare, information operations. I mean, we went to the Georgians' National Security Administration equivalent a couple years ago. So we're going in the building. I'm like, okay, where do you want me to put my cell phone? They're like, oh, you can keep it with you. I'm like, okay, this is why we have a problem. And then the last piece, right? I mean, decreasing corruption and increasing the legitimacy of the government, right? This isn't going to work in the Baltics as long as they don't, administer language laws or something that'll, completely anger the ethnic Russian population, right? Again, you have in Latvia and Estonia, roughly 25 to 30% of the population is ethnic Russian. If you ask them who they cheer for during the Olympics, they will say Russia. If you ask them what they think they are they Russian or Estonian, they will say they're Russian. They ask them if they want Estonia to be part of Russia, they will tell you no, right? They like their civil liberties. They like the higher standard of living that they have on that side of the border. And so until those nations do something to really alienate the population, if Putin tries to initiate kind of civil unrest there, they're going to be like, hey, we don't want this. We've seen what Ukraine and Donbass looks like, and we want no part of that. No desire for that. And so that's what you're trying to, and ultimately, right, what Russia's main effort really is political subversion. I mean, they may want to take over the Baltics and Ukraine again, but I think they look at the world the way it is. It's probably not a realistic strategy. So short of that, hey, just political subversion, let's just make them weak, and that's enough. Making the West look weak, legitimizing it, right, and is always good for Russia. Yeah, this just shows you, I mean, just some quick, right, these are, numbers, but this kind of shows, in 2014, this is kind of like by size, how much aid was. But if you think of what U.S. foreign military aid was to Ukraine in 2014 was very small. And then you kind of see what it is. Again, this is in 2016, yes. But it's still really a relatively modest effort, right? $525 million is really not that significant in terms of the money that we spend elsewhere and for the threat they're facing. Leave with a couple things here to kind of think about. So this kind of attitude towards Russia, the public opinion, and this is attitude towards the United States. So right here, obviously this is 2014, February 2014. But right, pretty positive attitude towards Russia. And again, this is going to be, it's probably 52% because everybody in the East is going to be in the South is like, yes, Russia. And the West are kind of like, not so much, but 12% against, and the rest are just kind of neutral. But we see this kind of really just changing here in 2014. And those numbers have stayed pretty consistent since. And then the attitude toward you, that's less important, right? But those have been pretty consistent as well. And so, you got to wonder, okay, what's Putin's what's his long-term gain here, right? If it is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and the EU, right? Success, right? It's tough to do when you have these contested borders. But if his long-term gain is to make Ukraine turn back east, right? He is failing in that. And the longer this lasts, the more and more he's locking it in, right? Some would say, hey, Ukraine, his actions there really made Ukraine a nation that it never really was prior. And so the longer this goes on, right, is Putin, is he getting what he wants out of this? Arguably not. And the last thing, I mean, these are just kind of showing violations. These are like, 2,000, 4,000. These are, daily or weekly violations in this, what was formerly the anti-terrorist operation, now joint forces operational area in the East. But what it's showing is that there's a significant violations of those Minsk treaties on a daily basis, numbering in the hundreds or thousands each day. And then kind of I'll wrap it up. I mean, for them, this is going to be a long war, right? What's the end state for this, right? This is a significant burden in terms of rotation of troops for Ukraine out there. For Russia, right, it's still a relative bargain, right? It doesn't costing them that much for what it is, and it is costing Ukrainians. But everybody that we've talked with over there, conducting the training and assistance missions for the Ukrainians, right, they all say, hey, these are not Afghanis or Iraqis. This is a highly educated populace. It's highly motivated, and the quality of the soldiers is much, much higher than Afghanistan and Iraq. The other piece I'll say, I forgot to mention on the policy piece. So when we first took over, right, what we were providing was there was a decision made, I think primarily by Susan Rice under the previous administration, that we're going to provide non-lethal aid to the Ukrainians. So that meant we couldn't provide Javelin weapon systems. We couldn't provide sniper weapon systems. and we could provide certain kind of training. We wouldn't provide sniper training, but we would provide basic kind of soldier training. I don't know what the heck non-lethal weapons are, what non-lethal training is, right? Everything you do in the military is lethal. I don't understand what that means. So we tried to just kind of change that terminology. We're like, there is no such thing as lethal aid, right? It's just defensive aid. We were providing them aid to defend themselves. And so it took a while to it took about a year to kind of get that, to kind of change the verbiage of that and then kind of clean it up. Then it's not a decision, okay, what's lethal, what's not lethal? Hey, no, what is defensive aid that they need to defend themselves? And again, this cost of aid is still, it's relatively minimal, right? They're still, right, if maybe Ukraine will eventually retire. They haven't gotten it, it's been 3-4 years now on that graph I just showed you, but hey, at some point, maybe Ukraine just gets tired and goes, okay, we're never going to join NATO, we're never going to join EU. The West really isn't helping us, maybe we're just going to turn back to our big brother, to the big bear. All right, so with that, I will wrap it up so we have time for questions.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Please do not forget to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.